What it was like to be a medieval scribe, let me guess what you're picturing right now. A kindly old monk with a perfectly trimmed tonsure, sitting peacefully in a sun-dappled scriptorium, carefully illuminating the opening letter of a book of hours with delicate gold leaf. Perhaps he's humming a gentle plainchant while a shaft of warm light streams through a Gothic window, highlighting the serenity on his face as he creates timeless beauty with steady, practiced hands. The camera slowly pulls back to reveal rows of similarly blessed brothers, all working in harmonious silence, preserving civilization one carefully crafted letter at a time. Stop it. Stop it right now. That image is about as accurate as saying Robin Hood was a cheerful socialist who redistributed wealth through archery contests. It's Hollywood nonsense, Renaissance romanticism, and Victorian wishful thinking, all rolled into one steaming pile of historical garbage. The reality of being a medieval scribe was so far removed from this fantasy that you'd need a telescope to see the connection. You want to know what it was really like to be a medieval scribe? Imagine the worst office job you've ever had. Now multiply the mind-numbing repetition by 10, the physical discomfort by 20, the job insecurity by 50, and the social status by negative infinity. Add in the constant threat of eternal damnation if you make a mistake copying sacred texts, the very real possibility of going blind before you're 40, and the knowledge that one technological innovation could make your entire skill set as useful as a chocolate teapot. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval manuscript production. But before we dive into the exquisite misery that awaited anyone foolish enough to pursue this profession, let's destroy a few more myths, shall we? First, most scribes weren't monks. Shocking, I know. By the later medieval period, the majority of professional scribes were secular workers, laypeople who had learned to read and write, which was about as common as finding a unicorn in your garden shed. Second, they weren't preserving civilization out of some noble calling. They were trying to make a living in a world where literacy was the only thing standing between them, and a life of manual labor that would kill them even faster than hunching over manuscripts. And third, perhaps most importantly, they didn't choose this life. Nobody woke up as a child and declared, "When I grow up, I want to spend my days copying the same psalms over and over until my hand cramps into a permanent claw and my eyes weep blood." No, becoming a scribe was what happened when all your other options had been exhausted, when fate had backed you into a corner so tight that spending your days transcribing religious texts seemed like the lesser of several evils. So how did you end up here? How did you, specifically, come to be hunched over a writing desk in a stone room so cold your breath forms clouds, desperately trying to form letters with fingers so stiff they barely respond to your commands? The path to this particular hell was rarely straight and never voluntary. Perhaps you were the fourth son of a minor lord, born just late enough to inherit nothing but a name and the expectation that you'd find your own way in the world. Your older brothers got the land, the title, and the military training. You got a basic education and a pat on the head. Young Geoffrey shows promise with his letters, they said. Perhaps the church has use for him. What they meant was, young Geoffrey is useless for anything that requires actual courage or strength, so let's see if we can foist him off on some monastery before he becomes a complete embarrassment to the family name. Or maybe you were born to merchants who had accumulated just enough wealth to get ideas above their station. They figured that having a son who could read and write would elevate the family's social position. They scraped together enough coin to send you to a cathedral school where you learned Latin grammar and practiced forming letters on wax tablets. But then the family business failed. Perhaps a ship was lost at sea, or a warehouse fire consumed their inventory, or they simply backed the wrong side in one of the endless political conflicts that plagued medieval commerce. Suddenly, that expensive education became your only marketable skill, and the only people hiring scribes were churches and monasteries that paid in prayers and thin soup. Or perhaps, and this was depressingly common, you were simply born smart in a world that had very little use for intelligence. You were the peasant's son who could somehow puzzle out the meaning of written words, the baker's daughter who showed an inexplicable talent for forming letters. In any other era, this might have been seen as a gift. In the medieval period, it marked you as different, potentially dangerous, and certainly unsuited for honest manual labor. The local priest noticed your abilities and suggested you might serve God better with a pen than with a plow. What he didn't mention was that serving God with a pen was only marginally better than starving to death, and considerably worse for your long-term health prospects. But let's say you found yourself committed to this path, either by circumstance or by the well-meaning intervention of adults who thought they were doing you a favor. You've been accepted as an apprentice scribe, which sounds impressive until you realize it's roughly equivalent to being accepted as a professional thumb twiddler. You're about to discover that everything you thought you knew about writing was laughably inadequate preparation for what lay ahead. Next, you'll learn exactly what it means to prepare for a day's work when that work requires materials more precious than gold, tools that must be maintained with obsessive precision, and a workspace designed seemingly by someone who actively hated human comfort. The romantic notion of simply sitting down with quill and parchment will be ground into dust along with your naive assumptions about the dignity of scholarly labor. The first thing that hits you when you enter a real scriptorium isn't the peaceful atmosphere or the scholarly ambience. It's the cold. Stone buildings in Northern Europe are magnificent for many things: intimidating enemies, impressing visitors, and demonstrating the power and permanence of the institutions that built them. Keeping human beings comfortable while they perform delicate manual labor is not among these strengths. The scriptorium, where you'll spend your days, is typically located on the north side of the monastery or cathedral, specifically chosen because northern exposure provides the most consistent light throughout the day. This architectural decision makes perfect sense from an illumination standpoint, and absolutely no sense from a human comfort standpoint. Northern exposures in medieval buildings are approximately as warm as the inside of a tomb, with roughly the same ambience. You'll arrive each morning before dawn, because the best light comes in the early hours, and you'll work by whatever illumination filters through windows that are, at best, thin sheets of oiled parchment, or, if you're incredibly lucky, small panes of glass so thick and distorted that looking through them is like viewing the world through water. The lucky few might have access to expensive beeswax candles, but more likely you'll be working by the light of tallow candles made from animal fat, which provide illumination that flickers constantly and produces smoke that makes your eyes water and your throat close up. But before you can even think about sitting down to write, you need to prepare your materials. And this is where you begin to understand just how precarious your entire profession really is. Parchment, real parchment, made from carefully prepared animal skins, costs more than most people's monthly wages. A single sheet of high-quality vellum represents the processed hide of a calf, and the preparation process is so labor-intensive and specialized that wasting even a small piece is a catastrophe. You don't get to practice on the good stuff. Nobody hands you a fresh sheet of vellum and says, "Here, try copying this gospel." Instead, you'll spend months, sometimes years, practicing on wax tablets, bark, broken pottery, and any other surface that will hold ink or scratches. When you finally graduate to actual parchment, it will be the stuff that's already been rejected by more experienced scribes. Pieces with flaws in the skin, irregular thickness, or stains that couldn't be removed during processing. And the ink. You can't just walk down to the medieval equivalent of Staples and pick up a bottle of black ink. No, you're going to make your own ink, and the process is going to teach you more about chemistry than most people learned in their entire lives. Iron gall ink, the standard for important documents, requires oak galls, growths on oak trees caused by wasp larvae, iron sulfate, gum arabic, and water. The process of brewing ink is part alchemy, part cooking, and part pure guesswork, because medieval recipes were about as precise as add some of this until it looks right. Get the proportions wrong, and your ink will fade within months, ruining weeks or months of work. Make it too acidic, and it will eat through the parchment. Too alkaline, and it won't adhere properly. And since you're working with organic materials in an era before standardized measurements or quality control, every batch is a gamble. You'll spend your career haunted by the knowledge that text you copied years ago might be slowly disappearing as inferior ink fades or attacks the parchment it was meant to preserve. But let's say you've successfully prepared your materials without destroying anything valuable. Now you need to ready your workspace, and this is where the physical reality of medieval manuscript production begins to assert itself with a vengeance. Your writing desk, if you're fortunate enough to have one to yourself, is a slanted wooden surface designed to hold your parchment at the optimal angle for writing. It's not designed for human comfort, because human comfort wasn't a consideration in its construction. You'll spend the next 8 to 12 hours hunched over this desk, your spine curved in a position that would make a modern chiropractor weep. Your left hand will hold the parchment in place while simultaneously attempting to steady your writing hand. Your right hand, assuming you're right-handed, and God help you if you're not, because left-handedness was often seen as a sign of moral corruption, will grip a quill pen cut from a goose or swan feather. The quill itself requires constant maintenance. Every few lines, you'll need to recut the tip to maintain its sharpness. Too dull, and your letters will be thick and imprecise. Too sharp, and you'll scratch through the parchment. The angle of the cut determines the width of your strokes, and achieving consistency requires a level of manual dexterity that takes years to develop. Your fingers will be permanently stained with ink, scarred from countless small cuts from the knife you use to maintain your quill, and cramped into positions that feel natural only after months of practice. And the writing itself, oh, the writing. You might think that if you can write, you can copy text. You might as well think that if you can walk, You can perform brain surgery. Medieval manuscript hands weren't just styles of writing. They were highly specialized technical skills that took years to master. Each letter had to be formed with precise proportions, consistent spacing, and exact relationships to every other letter on the page. If you were copying liturgical texts, you needed to master not just the standard bookund, but also specialized scripts for different types of content. Musical notation required entirely different skills. Decorated initials demanded artistic abilities that most scribes never developed. And all of this had to be done at a speed that made economic sense, because you were paid by the page, not by the hour. And taking too long meant you couldn't earn enough to survive. Now you're beginning to understand why the mortality rate among scribes was so appallingly high, and why most scribes were effectively finished by age 40. But wait, there's more to discover about the social dynamics that made this profession even more miserable than the working conditions alone would suggest. The social position of a scribe in medieval society was like being suspended in limbo between the damned and the saved, except that nobody was quite sure which direction you were heading. You weren't a peasant. You could read and write, which automatically placed you above the vast majority of the population. But you weren't nobility, clergy of any real importance, or even a successful merchant. You existed in a strange middle space that made everyone uncomfortable, including yourself. If you were lucky enough to work directly for a monastery, you might have achieved the status of a lay brother, which sounds impressive until you realize it meant you were essentially a servant who happened to be literate. You ate with the servants, slept in quarters barely better than the stables, and were expected to show deference to monks who might not be able to write their own names but outranked you by virtue of their religious vows. The actual monks viewed you with a mixture of necessity and disdain. They needed your skills, but they didn't trust your motives. After all, you were there for worldly reasons, to earn a living, rather than spiritual ones. This made you inherently suspect in their eyes. You were useful in the way that a particularly clever ox was useful, but you weren't really one of them, and you never would be. If you worked for secular patrons, the situation was somehow even worse. Nobles and wealthy merchants hired scribes the way they hired any other craftsmen, which meant you were subject to their whims, their schedules, and their often spectacularly unrealistic expectations. They wanted manuscripts produced quickly and cheaply, but they also wanted them to rival the finest work produced by the best scriptoriums in Europe. The fact that these demands were mutually contradictory was your problem to solve, not theirs to acknowledge. And the patrons, dear God, the patrons. They would commission elaborate manuscripts and then change their minds halfway through the project. They would demand revisions that required starting over completely. They would question every expense, haggle over every fee, and treat you like a particularly expensive piece of furniture that had developed the annoying habit of requiring food and shelter. Lady Margaret wants her Book of Hours to include an image of herself kneeling before the Virgin Mary, but she's not sure about the color of her dress. She changes her mind 4 times, each change requiring you to scrape away the previous work and start over. Lord William has commissioned a deluxe psalter, but has decided he wants it bound in a different color leather, which means the entire color scheme of the illuminations needs to be reconsidered. The merchant Gerard has ordered a breviary for his daughter's wedding, but the wedding has been postponed, and now he wants to pay half now and half when the wedding actually happens, which might be next month or next year or never. Meanwhile, you're trying to make a living from these people, which means you need to maintain multiple projects simultaneously, balance the competing demands of different patrons, and somehow maintain the diplomatic skills necessary to keep everyone happy while they slowly drive you insane with their endless revisions and unrealistic demands. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of your social position was the complete lack of credit or recognition for your work. The books you spent months creating were attributed to the monastery, the patron who commissioned them, or occasionally to a famous scholar whose name would be associated with the text. Your role as the person who actually created the physical manuscript was considered so unimportant that it was rarely even recorded. You might spend a year of your life creating a magnificent psalter, incorporating innovative artistic techniques, solving complex problems of layout and design, and producing something that would be treasured for centuries. But when people admired the finished work, they would praise the patron's taste, the monastery's dedication to scholarship, or the anonymous tradition of illuminated manuscripts. Your individual contribution would disappear into the collective achievement of medieval book production. This anonymity wasn't just professionally frustrating, it was psychologically devastating. You were pouring your life energy into creating objects of lasting beauty and importance, but you were doing it as invisibly as possible. The better you became at your craft, the more completely your individual identity disappeared behind the work itself. It was like being a ghost who could manipulate physical objects but could never be seen or acknowledged by the living. And if you made mistakes, well, that's where you'll discover exactly how unforgiving this profession could be, and why the phrase scribal error became synonymous with professional catastrophe. Next, you'll learn about the economic realities that made scribal work a constant gamble with your future, where a single error could cost you months of income, and a single dissatisfied patron could destroy your reputation permanently. The economics of medieval scribal work operated on a principle that would be familiar to anyone who has ever tried to make a living as a freelancer in the modern gig economy. Feast or famine, with famine being considerably more common than feast. Unlike modern freelancers, however, your potential for catastrophic professional disaster was multiplied by factors that would make a contemporary risk management specialist weep into their actuarial tables. Let's start with the basic mathematics of your survival. You were typically paid by the page, and the rate varied wildly depending on the type of text, the quality of materials required, the complexity of the work, and your patron's mood on the day payment was negotiated. For a basic text with no illumination, say, a simple psalter or breviary, you might earn enough in a day to buy food for 2 days, assuming nothing went wrong. For more complex work involving decorated initials or full illuminations, the pay was better, but the time investment was exponentially higher, and the opportunities for catastrophic mistakes multiplied accordingly. The problem was that you never knew when your next commission was coming. Medieval society didn't operate on the principle of steady, predictable demand for scribal services. Instead, you lived in a world where long periods of unemployment were punctuated by frantic rushes, when multiple patrons suddenly needed manuscripts completed immediately, often for seasonal religious celebrations, weddings, or other events that couldn't be postponed. During busy periods, you might work 18-hour days for weeks at a time, racing to complete multiple commissions simultaneously while the work was available. During slow periods, which could last for months, you would slowly watch your savings disappear while you waited for new projects and tried to maintain your tools and materials without any income to replace them. But the real economic terror of scribal work lay in the catastrophic risks that were simply part of the job. Imagine working for 3 months on a deluxe psalter, investing in the finest vellum, the most expensive inks, and countless hours of meticulous labor. Now imagine that on the final page, the very last page, you make a mistake. Not a small mistake that can be corrected by careful scraping and rewriting, but a major error that ruins the entire sheet and requires you to start that page over. But you don't have another sheet of the same vellum because it was a special order that took 2 months to acquire, and now you can't match it. The entire manuscript is ruined. 3 months of work gone. The materials cost, which came out of your own pocket, lost forever. The patron refuses to pay for a flawed manuscript, and your reputation for reliability takes a blow that might cost you future commissions. This wasn't a theoretical risk. It was a constant reality. Every stroke of your pen carried the potential for disaster. A momentary lapse in concentration, a sneeze at the wrong moment, a slight tremor in your hand caused by fatigue or cold. Any of these could destroy weeks of work instantly and irreversibly. And the clients would drive you to contemplate violence against your fellow human beings with a frequency that would alarm modern mental health professionals. They would commission manuscripts with impossible deadlines, then disappear for months without paying advances. They would demand revisions that doubled the work involved while refusing to adjust the payment accordingly. They would change their specifications midway through projects, insist on materials you couldn't afford to purchase without payment, and treat you like a combination of artist, servant, and indentured laborer. Lord Aldrich decides he wants his commissioned chronicle to include genealogical charts showing his family's connection to Charlemagne. This requires completely redesigning the page layouts, acquiring different colored inks, and learning techniques for creating complex diagrams that you've never attempted before. When you explain that this will double the time and cost of the project, he responds by threatening to find another scribe who can work within the original budget and timeline. When you point out that such a scribe doesn't exist, he suggests that perhaps you're not as skilled as you claim to be. Meanwhile, the Abbess Hildegard has commissioned a breviary for her convent, but the convent's finances are irregular, and payments arrive months late, if at all. You can't refuse the work because religious institutions are among your few reliable sources of commissions, but you also can't afford to work for months without payment. You find yourself in the impossible position of having to extend credit to the church while living on the edge of poverty yourself. And then there's the competition. Other scribes weren't your colleagues. They were your rivals for a limited pool of work. They would undercut your prices, spread rumors about your reliability, and steal your techniques while simultaneously claiming that your work was inferior to theirs. Professional solidarity was about as common as dragon sightings, and considerably less useful. The seasonal nature of demand made everything worse. Most manuscript commissions were tied to the church calendar, academic schedules, or social events that clustered around certain times of year. This meant that you might have 6 weeks of frantic, well-paid work followed by 4 months of scrambling for any paying project, no matter how poorly compensated. During slow periods, you would take on any work that involved writing, copying letters for illiterate merchants, preparing legal documents, teaching basic literacy to the children of ambitious families, or working on your own speculative projects in hopes of finding buyers later. None of this paid well, and much of it didn't pay at all until you found someone willing to purchase the finished work. The uncertainty was psychologically exhausting. You lived in constant fear of losing your source of income, of making a mistake that would ruin your reputation, of developing hand problems that would end your career, of technological changes that would make your skills obsolete. You went to sleep each night knowing that tomorrow might bring the commission that would secure your future for months, or the disaster that would destroy everything you had worked to build. And speaking of technological change, you were living through one of the most dramatic periods of technological disruption in human history, though you didn't know it yet. But before we get to the printing revolution that would ultimately make your profession extinct, you need to understand the psychological toll of spending your days copying the same religious texts over and over until the words lost all meaning, and your mind began to crack under the strain of enforced repetition. Next, you'll discover what it's like to slowly lose your sanity while copying the same psalms, prayers, and scripture verses thousands upon thousands of times, until the sacred words become meaningless sounds, and your consciousness, the weight of endless, mindless repetition. The psychological effects of copying the same religious texts for years on end were not what anyone expected when they entered the scribal profession. You might think that spending your days with sacred scripture would be spiritually uplifting, that the repeated exposure to psalms, prayers, and biblical passages would deepen your faith and provide comfort during long hours of tedious work. You would be catastrophically wrong. What actually happens when you copy the same religious texts thousands of times is that the words stop being words and start being abstract patterns. The 23rd Psalm, which might once have provided comfort and meaning, becomes a sequence of familiar letter combinations that your hand can reproduce without any conscious involvement from your brain. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," transforms into a series of automatic muscular responses, no more meaningful than the pattern of your breathing. This psychological transformation doesn't happen gradually. It happens suddenly, usually during your 2nd or 3rd year of professional copying. One day you're working on a familiar psalm, and you realize that you've completed 3 pages without actually reading a single word. Your hand has been forming letters, your mind has been monitoring the accuracy of your copying, but the meaning of the text has completely disappeared. You've become a machine for reproducing letter sequences, and the spiritual content might as well be random marks on parchment. The effect is profoundly disturbing. These aren't just any texts you're copying. They're supposed to be the Word of God, the most important and meaningful words in human existence. The fact that they've become meaningless to you feels like a form of spiritual death. You begin to worry that you've committed some terrible sin, that your soul is being corrupted by treating sacred words as mere patterns to be reproduced. But you can't stop copying them, because copying religious texts is how you earn your living. So you continue, day after day, reproducing words that have lost all meaning while trying to ignore the growing sense that you're damaging something essential in your relationship with the divine. It's like being forced to desecrate the very texts you're supposed to be preserving. The repetition becomes a form of torture that would impress medieval inquisitors with its subtlety and effectiveness. Imagine having a song stuck in your head, but instead of a catchy melody, it's "Blessed art thou among women," or "Lord, have mercy upon us," repeating endlessly in your consciousness. These phrases, copied hundreds or thousands of times, begin to echo in your mind even when you're not working. You wake up with Latin prayers scrolling through your consciousness like some sort of medieval mental ticker tape. The psalm verses start to blend together into a meaningless religious soup. "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord" becomes entangled with "The Lord is good to those who wait for him," which somehow connects to "blessed are those who mourn," until your brain is just cycling through familiar phrases without any coherent meaning or context. You know these texts better than anyone alive, but you understand them less with each passing day. And then there are the specialized texts that push you closer to complete psychological breakdown. If you're unlucky enough to be assigned to copy liturgical calendars, you'll spend months reproducing lists of saints' days, feast days, and religious observances. Saint Agatha, virgin and martyr, appears 365 times per year across multiple manuscripts. Saint Blaise, bishop and martyr, follows it with clockwork regularity. These aren't even continuous texts with narrative content. They're just lists, endlessly repeated lists of names and titles that merge into a stream of meaningless religious data. The worst assignments are the psalters that require you to copy all 150 psalms multiple times per manuscript. By your 5th year as a scribe, you will have copied Psalm 23 so many times that you can write it while carrying on a conversation, eating a meal, or half asleep. The words have become so automated that they bypass your conscious mind entirely. You'll find yourself absent-mindedly writing, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," while thinking about what you're having for dinner, completely oblivious to the theological implications of what you're reproducing. The isolation makes everything worse. Scribal work requires silence and concentration, which means you spend your days alone with these endlessly repeating texts and your increasingly fragmented thoughts. You can't discuss your psychological difficulties with anyone, because admitting that sacred texts have become meaningless to you sounds dangerously close to heresy. You can't take breaks from the repetition, because the repetition is your job. You can't find variety in your work, because the demand is almost entirely for the same standard religious texts. Your mind begins to play tricks on you. After copying the same passages thousands of times, you start to notice patterns that probably aren't there. You begin to see hidden messages in the spacing of words, secret meanings in the arrangement of letters, connections between disparate passages that exist only in your overtaxed imagination. The repetition creates a state that's somewhere between meditation and madness, where the boundaries between meaningful text and meaningless pattern begin to dissolve. Some scribes develop a condition that wouldn't be properly understood until modern psychology: depersonalization. You begin to feel disconnected from your own actions, watching your hand form letters as if it belonged to someone else. The work becomes so automatic that you lose the sense that you're actually doing it. You're present in the scriptorium, you're producing acceptable work, but some essential part of your consciousness has gone elsewhere to protect itself from the endless repetition. Others develop what might be called religious obsessive-compulsive disorder. The constant exposure to prayers and sacred texts creates an overwhelming need to ensure that every word is perfect, every letter correctly formed, every piece of punctuation precisely placed. A minor smudge becomes evidence of spiritual failure. A slightly uneven line of text becomes proof that you're unworthy to handle sacred words. The psychological pressure to achieve impossible perfection grows with each passing day, until the fear of making mistakes becomes more powerful than your ability to actually do the work. The truly devastating part is that this psychological breakdown is not a bug in the system, it's a feature. The medieval church actually wanted scribes to become so thoroughly immersed in sacred texts that their individual personalities dissolved into the work. The ideal scribe was supposed to be a transparent medium for reproducing God's word, not a creative individual with thoughts and feelings of his own. Your psychological disintegration wasn't a tragic side effect of the profession. It was evidence that you were becoming properly suited for your role. But even as your mind slowly disintegrated under the weight of endless repetition, you still had to maintain absolute accuracy in your work, because even the smallest error could have consequences that would make your current psychological suffering seem like a pleasant distraction. Next, you'll understand exactly why making mistakes while copying sacred texts wasn't just professionally embarrassing. It was potentially catastrophic for your soul, your livelihood, and your physical safety, and why the fear of errors would become a constant, paralyzing terror that haunted every moment of your working life. The fear of making mistakes while copying religious manuscripts wasn't just professional anxiety. It was existential terror that could paralyze your hand and destroy your ability to function as a human being. This wasn't merely about losing income or disappointing a client. This was about potentially damning your soul while simultaneously destroying your livelihood and possibly your life. Let's start with the theological implications, because in medieval society, these were the most important and the most terrifying. When you copied sacred texts, you weren't just reproducing information, you were handling the literal word of God. Every letter you formed was supposed to be a perfect reproduction of divine revelation. A mistake wasn't just an error, it was a corruption of sacred truth, a distortion of God's message to humanity. The theological weight of this responsibility was crushing. If you accidentally changed "the Lord is good" to "the Lord is God," you might have created a heretical statement that could mislead readers about the nature of divine goodness. If you skipped a word in a psalm, you were essentially editing scripture, which was considered one of the most serious sins imaginable. If you miscopied a prayer, you might be creating something that wouldn't actually reach God, leaving the people who used your manuscript spiritually abandoned. The church taught that scribal errors in sacred texts could have eternal consequences not just for you, but for everyone who used the corrupted manuscripts. A priest reading from your flawed breviary might inadvertently say something heretical during Mass. A monk using your psalter might unknowingly pray incorrectly for years. A noble family using your Book of Hours might find their devotions ineffective because of your mistakes. The spiritual welfare of countless souls could be jeopardized by a moment's inattention on your part. This meant that every stroke of your pen was made under the weight of potential damnation. You weren't just worried about making mistakes. You were terrified that your human fallibility would corrupt the Word of God and drag both yourself and others to hell. The psychological pressure was so intense that many scribes developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, complete with physical symptoms that made their work even more difficult. Your hands would shake as you approached particularly important passages. Your vision would blur when you tried to focus on complex theological terminology. You would break out in cold sweats while copying the most sacred texts, knowing that a single error could have consequences that extended into eternity. Some scribes became so paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes that they essentially became unable to work, spending hours staring at blank parchment, while their minds cycled through all the possible ways they might corrupt the text they were supposed to copy. But the theological terror was just the beginning. Scribal errors also had immediate, practical consequences that could destroy your career and your life with stunning efficiency. Remember that you were working with materials that cost more than most people's annual income. A serious mistake that couldn't be corrected meant that the entire manuscript was worthless, and the financial loss could bankrupt you instantly. A simple example: you're copying a deluxe psalter that requires 3 months of work and uses vellum that costs the equivalent of a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. On page 200 of 250, you make a mistake that requires you to start that page over. But you don't have another sheet of matching vellum, and the supplier can't provide a match because the original batch came from a specific group of calves processed months ago. The entire manuscript is now unusable because one page doesn't match the rest. Who pays for this disaster? You do. The patron isn't going to accept financial responsibility for your error, and you can't simply bill them for the cost of your mistake. The entire loss comes out of your pocket: the vellum, the inks, the 3 months of labor, everything. This single error could leave you so deeply in debt that you would never recover financially. But it gets worse. Your reputation in the scribal community was everything, and a single major error could destroy it permanently. Medieval society was small and interconnected, especially among the educated classes who commissioned manuscripts. Word of your mistake would spread quickly through the network of monasteries, noble houses, and merchant families who employed scribes. Within months, everyone who mattered would know that you were the scribe who ruined a 3-month project with a careless error. Future patrons would avoid you, not because they doubted your technical skills, but because they couldn't afford to risk having their own projects destroyed by your fallibility. Other scribes would whisper about your failure, using your mistake as evidence of their own superior reliability. Your name would become synonymous with unreliability, and in a profession where trust was everything, this was essentially a professional death sentence. The types of errors that could destroy you weren't limited to obvious mistakes like misspelled words or missing lines. Medieval manuscripts operated under standards of precision that would challenge modern perfection-obsessed professionals. The spacing between words had to be consistent. The alignment of text had to be perfect. The color intensity of inks had to match exactly across different sections of the manuscript. The proportions of decorated letters had to conform to established artistic conventions. A mistake as subtle as using slightly too much ink in one letter could throw off the visual balance of an entire page. An almost imperceptible variation in line spacing could make a manuscript look unprofessional. A barely noticeable tremor in your hand while forming a decorated initial could render months of work unacceptable to a discerning patron. And some errors were quite literally fatal. If you were working on legal documents, liturgical texts used in official church ceremonies, or manuscripts commissioned by powerful political figures, certain types of mistakes could be interpreted as deliberate sabotage. Changing dates in historical chronicles could be seen as an attempt to falsify records. Altering legal formulas could be viewed as fraud. Modifying prayers or sacred texts could be treated as heresy. In a society where heresy was punishable by death, and where fraud against powerful patrons could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution, the consequences of scribal errors extended far beyond professional embarrassment. You were literally risking your life every time you dipped your pen in ink, because the difference between a successful career and a catastrophic disaster was measured in millimeters of precision and moments of concentration. The constant fear of making mistakes created a vicious cycle that made errors more likely, not less. The more terrified you became of making mistakes, the more your hands shook, the more your concentration wavered, and the more likely you were to make the very errors you were desperately trying to avoid. Many scribes developed rituals, superstitions, and compulsive behaviors designed to prevent mistakes, but these often made their work slower and more laborious without actually reducing the error rate. You might find yourself checking and rechecking every letter multiple times before moving on to the next one, turning a day's work into a week's work. You might develop elaborate preparation rituals, praying specific prayers, arranging your tools in precise patterns, or copying practice letters on scrap material before beginning each page. That consumed hours of time and mental energy without providing any real protection against errors. Some scribes became so obsessed with avoiding mistakes that they essentially stopped working altogether, spending more time worrying about potential errors than actually copying text. Others developed the opposite problem, becoming so paralyzed by perfectionist anxiety that they would start over completely at the first sign of any imperfection, never finishing anything because nothing could meet their impossible standards. The irony was that the scribes who lasted longest in the profession were often those who learned to accept that occasional errors were inevitable and developed techniques for correcting them rather than preventing them. But this pragmatic approach required a level of psychological resilience that most people simply didn't possess, especially when the consequences of failure were so severe. And all of this terror, this constant anxiety, this paralyzing fear of making mistakes, It was taking place in working conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards, conditions designed seemingly by someone who wanted to maximize the likelihood of the very errors that could destroy your life. Next, you'll experience the physical reality of spending your entire adult life hunched over manuscripts in conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever conceived, slowly destroying your body, while your mind fragments under the pressure of impossible demands for perfection. The human body was not designed for scribal work. This becomes painfully obvious within your first month of professional copying, but the full scope of the physical devastation doesn't become apparent until you've been at it for several years, and your body has been permanently reshaped by the demands of your profession. Your spine is the first casualty. Medieval writing desks were designed to hold manuscripts at the optimal angle for ink flow and visual clarity, not to support human beings in sustainable working positions. You'll spend 12 hours a day bent over your work at an angle that places maximum stress on your cervical and lumbar vertebrae. Your head will be tilted forward and down, your shoulders hunched, your upper back curved into a permanent C shape that becomes more pronounced with each passing month. By your third year, you'll notice that you can't stand fully upright anymore. Your natural posture has adapted to your working position, and when you try to straighten your back, it feels unnatural and uncomfortable. By your fifth year, attempting to stand straight will actually cause pain, as your muscles and ligaments have shortened and tightened to accommodate your habitual hunched position. You've essentially trained your body to be shaped like a question mark, and reversing this process becomes increasingly impossible as time passes. Your hands and wrists suffer damage that would fascinate modern orthopedic specialists. The medieval quill pen requires a very specific grip and angle that places enormous stress on the small muscles and joints of your fingers. Unlike modern pens, which are designed to minimize hand strain, quill pens must be held at precise angles to control ink flow and line width. This means maintaining static muscle tension in your fingers, wrist, and forearm for hours at a time. The repetitive motion of forming letters creates inflammatory conditions in your tendons that have no medieval names, but would be instantly recognizable to any modern office worker. Carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, and trigger finger. Your writing hand develops a permanent claw-like shape as the muscles contract and refuse to fully relax even when you're not working. Your grip becomes so adapted to holding a quill that you have difficulty manipulating other objects with precision. But the truly insidious damage is happening in your eyes. Medieval scriptoriums were lit by whatever natural light could filter through small windows, supplemented by candles or oil lamps that produced flickering, inconsistent illumination. You're spending your days focusing on tiny details, individual letters that might be only a few millimeters tall, in lighting conditions that strain your vision beyond its natural limits. The constant close focus work causes your eye muscles to become locked in the near vision position. After a few years, you'll find that you have increasing difficulty seeing distant objects clearly. Your eyes have literally adapted to permanent close-up work, and the muscles that control focus have lost the ability to fully relax. Medieval scribes routinely went blind by age 40, not from any disease, but from the cumulative damage of years of close work in poor lighting conditions. The flickering candlelight creates additional problems. Your pupils are constantly adjusting to variations in light intensity, which causes eye strain and headaches that can become debilitating. The smoke from tallow candles irritates your eyes and respiratory system, causing constant tearing and coughing that makes precise work even more difficult. Many scribes develop chronic respiratory problems from years of breathing smoke and dust in poorly ventilated stone buildings. Your neck suffers from a combination of the forward head posture required for close work and the constant downward gaze needed to see your manuscript. The muscles at the base of your skull become chronically tight and painful. You'll develop frequent headaches that start at the back of your neck and radiate forward over your scalp. These aren't minor discomforts. They're severe, debilitating pains that can make it impossible to concentrate on your work, which creates additional stress because you can't afford to take time off for recovery. The cold makes everything worse. Medieval stone buildings are essentially expensive caves, and the north-facing scriptoriums where you work are consistently the coldest rooms in already frigid structures. Your hands become so cold that you lose fine motor control, making precise letter formation increasingly difficult. Cold muscles are tight muscles, and tight muscles are injured muscles, so the low temperatures directly contribute to the development of chronic pain conditions throughout your body. You'll spend your days with hands so cold that you can barely feel the quill pen, trying to form letters with fingers that respond sluggishly to your commands. The cold affects your ink as well. It flows more slowly and inconsistently, making it harder to achieve the precise line weights that your work requires. You might try to warm your hands over a small brazier or by rubbing them together, but this takes time away from your work and provides only temporary relief. The workspace itself becomes a source of physical torture. Your wooden stool has no padding and no back support. Your feet rest on cold stone floors that suck the warmth from your body. Your writing desk is at a fixed height that may or may not be appropriate for your body proportions, and medieval society had no concept of ergonomic adjustment. If the desk is too high, you'll develop shoulder and neck problems from holding your arms in an unnatural position. If it's too low, you'll develop back problems from hunching over even more than usual. The tools of your trade contribute to your physical deterioration. The knife you use to cut and maintain your quill pens is sharp enough to be dangerous, and most scribes bear a collection of scars from years of small accidents. Your fingers become permanently stained with ink, not just superficially, but deep into the skin and under the nails. The acidic nature of iron gall ink causes chemical burns if you're exposed to it regularly, leaving your hands rough, cracked, and painful. But perhaps the most devastating physical effect is the cumulative exhaustion that comes from maintaining impossible standards of precision, while your body slowly breaks down around you. You're trying to do detail work that requires steady hands and sharp eyes while suffering from chronic pain, vision problems, respiratory irritation, and the general physical deterioration that comes from years of abuse. Your sleep becomes disrupted because your body can't find a comfortable position after spending all day in unnatural postures. Your chronic pain interferes with rest, which makes it harder to maintain concentration during work, which increases the likelihood of making mistakes, which increases your stress levels, which makes your physical problems worse. It's a downward spiral that has no bottom except complete physical breakdown. By your 10th year as a scribe, if you last that long, you'll look 20 years older than your actual age. Your hands will be gnarled and stained, your back permanently curved, your eyes weak and strained. You'll move like an old man regardless of your chronological age, and your life expectancy will have been reduced by decades due to the cumulative physical damage of your profession. And this is assuming you're working in one of the better scriptoriums. Many scribes worked in conditions that were significantly worse, darker, colder, more cramped, with inferior tools and materials that made their jobs even more physically punishing. But even as your body gradually destroyed itself in service to your profession, you had to maintain not just your output, but also your social relationships with the people who controlled your livelihood, people who had no understanding of or sympathy for the physical toll your work exacted. Next, you'll discover the elaborate social dance required to manage patrons who treated you as a combination of artist, servant, and magical ink dispensing machine, while navigating the complex politics of religious institutions, where your useful skills made you valuable but your secular motivations made you perpetually suspect. The politics of survival as a medieval scribe required diplomatic skills that would challenge a modern ambassador, because your livelihood depended entirely maintaining relationships with people who had absolute power over your fate and no incentive to treat you with consideration or respect. You existed in a social space that was simultaneously essential and disposable, valuable and contemptible, trusted and suspected. Religious patrons presented their own unique challenges. When working for monasteries or individual clerics, you were operating within institutions that viewed secular motivations with deep suspicion. You were there to earn money, which marked you as spiritually inferior to the monks who had supposedly transcended worldly concerns. Never mind that many of those monks were there because their families had essentially dumped them on the church to avoid inheritance complications, or because they had failed at every other career option available to them. The monastic hierarchy treated scribes with the particular disdain reserved for people who were necessary but not welcome. You were useful in the way that a well-functioning latrine was useful, essential for the operation of the institution, but not something anyone wanted to think about more than absolutely necessary. The monks needed your skills, but they didn't want to acknowledge that their spiritual endeavors depended on someone whose primary motivation was putting food on his table. This created a constant tension in your daily interactions. You had to demonstrate appropriate religious devotion while simultaneously making it clear that you were competent and professional. Too much piety, and you would be suspected of trying to elevate your status inappropriately. Too little, and you would be seen as spiritually corrupted and unsuitable for handling sacred texts. The balance was impossible to maintain consistently, and the consequences of getting it wrong could range from subtle social ostracism to outright dismissal. Brother Augustine might praise your work on illuminated initials, while simultaneously making snide comments about scribes who were too concerned with worldly beauty to appreciate spiritual substance. Father Benedict might commiserate with you about the difficulties of manuscript production, while carefully reminding you that your struggles were insignificant compared to the spiritual battles fought by true servants of God. The abbot might express satisfaction with your productivity, while pointedly noting that real devotion couldn't be measured in pages completed per day. Every conversation was a minefield, where a single wrong word could damage relationships you had spent months building. You had to be grateful for the opportunity to serve God through your work, but not so grateful that you seemed to be claiming spiritual merit for secular labor. You had to be confident in your professional abilities, but not so confident that you appeared prideful or presumptuous. You had to be concerned with practical matters like payment and working conditions, but not so concerned that you seemed to prioritize material concerns over spiritual ones. Secular patrons were different but equally challenging. Noble families and wealthy merchants hired scribes the way they hired any other craftsman, which meant you were expected to be simultaneously skilled, reliable, invisible, and grateful. They wanted to feel sophisticated and cultured for commissioning manuscripts, but they didn't want to be reminded that their cultural sophistication depended on people whose social status was barely above that of servants. Lady Matilda would commission an elaborate book of hours, and then treat you like a piece of furniture that had developed the inconvenient ability to speak. She would discuss changes to the manuscript as if you weren't present, referring to the scribe in third person while you stood directly in front of her. When she did address you directly, it was usually to complain about costs, deadlines, or aspects of the work that she didn't understand but was certain could be done better, faster, or cheaper. Lord Geoffrey would inspect your work with the air of someone examining a horse he was considering purchasing. He would point out perceived flaws that existed only in his imagination, question techniques that had been standard practice for centuries, and generally treat you like an incompetent apprentice who needed constant supervision. The fact that he couldn't read the text you were copying didn't prevent him from having strong opinions about how the work should be done. The merchant families were often the worst, because they combined the social insecurity of the newly wealthy with the practical shrewdness of people who had built their fortunes through hard bargaining. They would haggle over every aspect of your fees, demand additional work without additional payment, and constantly remind you that they had other options if you proved unsatisfactory. They treated manuscript commissioning like any other business transaction, which meant they expected to get maximum value for minimum cost, regardless of the artistic or technical requirements of the work. Master William, the cloth merchant, would commission a psalter for his daughter's wedding, and then spend months trying to negotiate additional services that weren't part of the original agreement. Could you also provide the binding? Could you include extra illustrations? Could you use higher quality materials without increasing the price? Could you finish the work faster so it would be ready for an earlier wedding date that had just been arranged? Each request was presented as a reasonable accommodation that any competent scribe should be happy to provide. But the most exhausting aspect of patron management was the constant need to educate people who had no understanding of your craft about why their expectations were unrealistic. Medieval manuscript production was a complex technical and artistic process, but most patrons saw only the final result and assumed that creating it was as simple as writing a letter with fancier materials. They didn't understand why you couldn't just write faster to meet impossible deadlines. They didn't grasp why changing the color scheme of illuminations halfway through a project required starting over completely. They couldn't comprehend why using different materials would affect the timeline and cost of the work. They saw manuscript production as essentially an administrative task that could be managed through willpower and efficiency, rather than as a specialized craft that required years of training and experience. Explaining these realities to patrons required enormous tact, because you were essentially telling powerful people that they didn't understand what they were talking about. You had to educate them without insulting their intelligence, set realistic expectations without seeming to make excuses, and defend your professional standards without appearing inflexible or unreasonable. The conversations were exhausting exercises in diplomatic doublespeak. My lord, while it would certainly be possible to complete this psalter in half the time you've suggested, doing so would require compromises in quality that I believe would not meet your standards for a manuscript intended to honor your family's devotion. Was scribe speak for? You have no idea what you're talking about, and what you're asking for is impossible. My lady, the additional illuminations you've requested would certainly enhance the beauty of the breviary, but incorporating them would require redesigning the existing page layouts, which would extend the completion date somewhat. Meant, your last-minute changes are going to double the work involved and push back the deadline by months. Master Robert, the materials you've suggested would indeed reduce the cost of the project, but they might not provide the longevity that would be appropriate for a manuscript intended for regular liturgical use. Translated to cheap materials will produce a cheap-looking manuscript that will fall apart within a few years. Every negotiation was an elaborate dance where you had to protect your professional standards, manage unrealistic expectations, and maintain relationships with people who held your financial future in their hands, all while never directly contradicting or challenging their authority. One poorly phrased explanation, one moment of obvious frustration, one inadvertent slight to their intelligence or judgment could cost you not just a single commission, but your entire reputation within the interconnected networks of medieval society. And meanwhile, you were trying to do all of this while your body was slowly breaking down from the physical demands of your work. Your mind was fragmenting from the endless repetition of meaningless texts, and your financial situation remained constantly precarious despite your best efforts to maintain steady income through careful relationship management. Next, you'll understand the particular psychological torture of working in enforced silence for years at a time, cut off from normal human interaction while your thoughts spiral inward until the boundaries between your consciousness and the text you're copying begin to dissolve completely. The silence of the scriptorium wasn't the peaceful, meditative quiet that you might imagine when you think of scholarly work. It was an oppressive, enforced isolation that slowly drove many scribes to the edge of madness as their starved minds turned inward and began cannibalizing themselves for stimulation. Medieval monasteries operated under strict rules about when and where conversation was permitted, and scriptoriums were considered places of sacred work, where unnecessary speech was a distraction from spiritual labor. This meant that you could spend entire days without speaking to another human being, communicating only through hand signals, written notes, or the occasional necessary whisper about work-related matters. At first, the silence seems beneficial. You can concentrate on your work without distraction, focus entirely on the precise formation of letters, immerse yourself completely in the task at hand. But after a few months, the absence of normal human interaction begins to have effects that no one anticipated when they designed these working conditions. Your inner voice, the constant stream of thoughts and observations that normally gets expressed through conversation, begins to intensify and take on a life of its own. Without the outlet of speech, your mental commentary becomes louder, more insistent, more demanding of attention. You start having elaborate conversations with yourself, arguments with imaginary critics of your work, detailed planning sessions for projects that will never exist. The texts you're copying begin to take on personalities and voices in your mind. The Psalms start to sound different from the Gospels, not just in content, but in the imaginary voice that reads them in your consciousness. St. Augustine's Confession develops a different mental accent than St. Jerome's letters. You begin to feel like you're surrounded by a crowd of long-dead authors who are constantly talking in your head, commenting on your work, criticizing your technique, offering opinions on everything from your posture to your spiritual state. This mental cacophony becomes overwhelming. You're simultaneously starved for real human conversation and drowning in imaginary voices. Your mind, desperate for the stimulation of social interaction, begins creating elaborate fantasy conversations with patrons, fellow scribes, family members, and historical figures. These mental dialogues become so vivid and detailed that you sometimes forget you haven't actually spoken to anyone in days. The isolation affects your ability to relate to real people when conversation is finally permitted or necessary. After spending days or weeks in your own head, the prospect of actual human interaction becomes anxiety-provoking. You've become so accustomed to controlling both sides of conversations in your imagination that dealing with unpredictable responses from real people feels jarring and uncomfortable. Your social skills atrophy from lack of use. You forget how to read facial expressions, interpret tone of voice, or navigate the subtle cues that make normal conversation possible. When you do have opportunities to speak with others, you find yourself either completely tongue-tied or uncontrollably verbose, either unable to participate in conversation or monopolizing it with desperate attempts to compensate for days of forced silence. The enforced quiet also amplifies every small sound until minor noises become major distractions. The scratch of quill pens on parchment, which should be barely audible, sounds like fingernails on slate. The turning of pages becomes as loud as thunder. Someone clearing their throat across the room feels like a shout that shatters your concentration completely. Your hypersensitive hearing makes it impossible to ignore the bodily functions of your fellow scribes. Every breath, every stomach rumble, every joint crack becomes an intrusion that breaks your focus and reminds you of your isolation. But the worst aspect of the silence is how it makes you disappear, even to yourself. Days pass without you hearing your own voice, and you begin to feel like you're fading away, becoming as incorporeal as the words you're copying. Your sense of individual identity starts to dissolve into the collective work of manuscript production. You exist only as a hand that forms letters, an eye that checks for errors, a mind that holds the correct spelling of Latin words. This loss of individual identity isn't metaphorical. It's a real psychological phenomenon that affects your ability to think of yourself as a separate person with independent thoughts and desires. You begin to identify so completely with your work that you lose track of where the scribe ends and the manuscript begins. Your personality becomes subsumed into the text you're copying until you're no longer sure which thoughts are your own and which ones belong to the long-dead authors whose words you're reproducing. The silence becomes a prison that traps you inside your own increasingly unstable consciousness. You can't share your growing psychological difficulties with anyone because talking about personal problems is forbidden in the working environment. You can't seek advice or comfort from colleagues because forming relationships would require conversation that isn't permitted. You can't even pray aloud for relief from your mental anguish because vocalized prayer might disturb others. Some scribes develop elaborate internal coping mechanisms that probably qualify as mild psychological disorders. They create detailed imaginary worlds where they can retreat during long hours of copying, complete with fictional characters, complex storylines, and ongoing narratives that provide the mental stimulation their isolated minds crave. Others develop obsessive counting behaviors, tracking the number of letters, words, lines, or pages they produce as a way of maintaining some sense of progress and achievement. Many scribes begin talking to their manuscripts, conducting one-sided conversations with the texts they're copying as if the books were conscious entities capable of responding. Yes, St. Matthew, I understand that you want this initial to be perfectly centered. Or, I hear you, St. Benedict, the spacing on this line needs adjustment, become normal parts of their internal monologue. And eventually some scribes begin mumbling these conversations under their breath, pushing the boundaries of the silence rule because their need for some form of interaction has become desperate. The psychological isolation is made worse by the physical isolation. Scriptoriums were deliberately located away from the main areas of monastic life, partly to minimize distractions, and partly to contain the secular contamination represented by scribes who were working for worldly rather than purely spiritual reasons. This meant you were cut off not just from conversation, but from the normal social rhythms of communal life. The shared meals, group prayers, collective activities that might provide some relief from the grinding loneliness of your daily work. You eat alone or with other scribes who are equally forbidden to speak. You sleep in quarters separate from the main community. You work in rooms that might as well be on a different planet from the rest of human society. The silence becomes total and absolute, a sensory deprivation that leaves you floating in a void of your own thoughts, while your hands mechanically reproduce words that have lost all meaning, and the silence follows you home. After years of enforced quiet, many scribes lose the ability to engage in normal conversation even when it's permitted. They become awkward, withdrawn people who have forgotten how to participate in the social world outside their profession. Their families become strangers, their friends drift away, and their only meaningful relationships are with the manuscripts they create and the imaginary voices that populate their isolated minds. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this psychological torture was that it was happening during a period of unprecedented technological change that would soon make your suffering completely pointless, eliminating your profession so thoroughly that future generations would remember scribes only as quaint medieval curiosities, rather than as real people who sacrificed their sanity, their health, and their lives to preserve human knowledge. Next, you'll discover how the printing revolution didn't just change the economics of book production. It obliterated an entire way of life overnight, leaving thousands of scribes as obsolete as the hand-copied manuscripts they had spent their lives perfecting, with skills that were suddenly as useless as the ability to shoe horses in an age of automobiles. The printing press wasn't just a technological innovation, it was an extinction event for the scribal profession, as sudden and devastating as a meteor impact that wiped out an entire species overnight. One day you were a skilled craftsman whose abilities were essential for preserving and transmitting human knowledge. The next day you were as obsolete as a professional flame tender in a world that had just discovered electric lighting. The speed of the change was breathtaking and terrifying. Gutenberg's Bible, completed around 1455, demonstrated that a single printing press could produce in months what would take a team of scribes years to accomplish. But the real catastrophe wasn't just that printing was faster. It was that printed books were cheaper, more consistent, and increasingly available to anyone who could read, while hand-copied manuscripts remained expensive, variable in quality, and accessible only to wealthy patrons. You might think that there would have been a gradual transition period where scribes could adapt their skills to the new technology, but you would be wrong. Printing didn't supplement manuscript production. It replaced it almost immediately. Why would anyone commission a hand-copied book that would take months to complete and cost a fortune when they could purchase a printed version for a fraction of the price and have it immediately? The economic mathematics were brutal and inescapable. A scribe working for an entire year might produce 3 or 4 complete manuscripts. A printing press could produce hundreds of copies of the same text in the same period. A hand-copied book required expensive materials and months of skilled labor. A printed book used cheaper paper and required only the initial setup costs of typesetting. There was no competition, no market niche where traditional scribal work could survive, no gradual decline that might have allowed for professional adaptation. The first sign of your profession's doom came when commissioning dried up. Patrons who had previously ordered multiple manuscripts per year suddenly stopped placing new orders. Religious institutions that had employed teams of scribes began laying off workers. Wealthy families who had collected hand-copied books started selling their libraries to purchase printed editions that were more portable, more durable, and infinitely more affordable. You watched your colleagues disappear one by one as the demand for hand-copied manuscripts evaporated. The most skilled illuminators found occasional work decorating printed books, but even this niche market was small and shrinking, as printers developed their own techniques for producing illustrated texts. The average scribe, the person who had spent decades perfecting the ability to copy text by hand, discovered that his skills had become completely worthless virtually overnight. But the truly heartbreaking aspect of the printing revolution was how it revealed the fundamental futility of everything you had sacrificed for your profession. All those years of physical agony, psychological isolation, economic uncertainty, and social humiliation had been endured in service to a technology that was about to become as obsolete as stone tools. Every manuscript you had painstakingly created could now be reproduced more accurately, more quickly, and more cheaply by a machine operated by workers who didn't need to know how to read or write. The irony was devastating. You had spent your life preserving human knowledge through the most advanced information technology available, only to discover that your advanced technology was actually primitive, inefficient, and fundamentally obsolete. It was like being a master blacksmith who discovers that someone has invented stainless steel factories, or a professional navigator who learns that satellites have made celestial navigation unnecessary. Your skills, which had taken decades to develop and had been essential for the functioning of medieval society, became museum pieces while you were still alive to witness their irrelevance. The careful formation of letters that had been your primary professional ability was now performed more precisely by carved wooden blocks and metal type. The knowledge of manuscript layout and design that you had accumulated through years of experience was now codified in printers' manuals that could be learned in weeks rather than decades. Even worse, the printing revolution revealed that much of what you had thought was essential about your profession was actually unnecessary complexity. The elaborate decorative elements that had taken years to master, printers could produce similar effects through wood-cut illustrations and decorative fonts. The careful preparation of materials that had consumed enormous amounts of time and money. Paper was cheaper, more consistent, and more durable than parchment. The meticulous proofreading that had been essential for hand-copied texts. Printing allowed for the production of multiple identical copies that eliminated transcription errors entirely. The social and economic displacement was immediate and total. Scribes who had spent their entire adult lives developing specialized skills found themselves competing for unskilled manual labor jobs alongside peasants and agricultural workers. Your literacy, which had once been your most valuable asset, became just another skill in a world where printed books were making literacy more common and less economically valuable. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the economic consequences. Your entire identity had been built around being a keeper of knowledge, a preserver of human learning, a link in the chain that connected ancient wisdom to contemporary readers. Suddenly, you were just an unemployed craftsman whose craft had become obsolete, like a cooper in a world that had invented plastic containers or a scrivener in an age of typewriters. The manuscripts you had spent your life creating became curiosities rather than functional books. Collectors might prize them for their historical value or artistic merit, but they were no longer practical tools for storing and transmitting information. Your life's work had been transformed from essential cultural infrastructure into decorative objects that were admired for their rarity rather than their utility. Some scribes tried to find work in the printing industry, but the skills didn't transfer in any meaningful way. Operating a printing press required different knowledge and abilities than copying manuscripts by hand. The careful attention to individual letters that had been essential for scribal work was irrelevant when dealing with preformed type. The artistic abilities needed for illumination were unnecessary when illustrations could be mass-produced through woodcuts and engravings. Others attempted to find niches where hand copying might still be valuable. Legal documents that required personalized elements, presentation copies for special occasions, or texts in languages that hadn't yet been adapted for printing. But these markets were tiny and shrinking, providing employment for only a handful of scribes, while thousands found themselves permanently displaced. The speed of technological change meant that there was no time for gradual adaptation or retraining. One year you were a skilled professional with steady employment and social recognition. The next year you were an unemployed anachronism whose primary qualification was proficiency in a technology that had become instantaneously obsolete. The printing revolution also destroyed the entire social and economic ecosystem that had supported scribal work. The networks of patrons, suppliers, and related craftsmen that had made manuscript production possible disappeared along with the demand for hand-copied books. The monasteries that had employed scribes reorganized their operations around printed materials. The wealthy families that had commissioned manuscripts redirected their cultural spending toward printed books and other forms of artistic patronage. Within a generation, the profession that had been essential for preserving human knowledge for over 1,000 years had become a historical footnote. The scribes who survived the transition became living reminders of a technological era that had ended so abruptly that many people couldn't believe it had ever existed. But even as you faced the complete destruction of your profession and the irrelevance of your life's work, there were still lessons to be learned from the experience of being a medieval scribe. Lessons that might help you understand why modern people could never have survived the realities of your profession, and why the romanticized image of the peaceful monk illuminating manuscripts bears no relationship to the actual experience of manuscript production in the medieval world. You think your modern life is difficult. You think your job is stressful. Your working conditions are challenging. Your economic situation is precarious. Let me explain exactly why you would have lasted approximately 3 days as a medieval scribe before crawling back to whatever soft, comfortable, digitally mediated existence you're currently complaining about. First, let's talk about physical endurance. You live in a world of ergonomic office chairs, adjustable desks, climate control, and abundant artificial lighting. You probably complain if your computer monitor isn't positioned at exactly the right height, or if the air conditioning makes your office slightly too cold. You consider 8 hours of desk work to be a full day, and you expect regular breaks, lunch hours, and weekends off. Now imagine spending 12 to 14 hours a day hunched over a wooden writing desk in a stone room where the temperature never rises above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine trying to form tiny, precise letters while your hands are so cold you can barely feel the pen. Your back is screaming from maintaining an unnatural position for hours, and your eyes are watering from the smoke of tallow candles that provide the only artificial light available. You would be crying for your ergonomic keyboard and your adjustable monitor within the first hour. You would be begging for central heating and electric lighting within the first day. You would be ready to abandon the entire profession within the first week, assuming you lasted that long without developing injuries that made continuing work impossible. But let's say you somehow adapted to the physical conditions. Could you handle the psychological pressure? You live in a world where mistakes can be corrected with delete keys and spell checkers, where rough drafts are expected and revisions are routine, where good enough is usually sufficient for most purposes. Your mistakes have minimal consequences, perhaps some embarrassment, possibly a minor setback, rarely anything more serious than temporarily hurt feelings or damaged pride. Medieval scribes lived with the knowledge that a single error could destroy months of work, bankrupt them financially, and potentially damn their souls for corrupting sacred texts. Every letter they formed carried the weight of eternal consequences. Every line they copied was a high-stakes gamble where the slightest mistake could lead to catastrophic failure. You couldn't handle that pressure. You would be paralyzed by anxiety within days, unable to put pen to parchment, because the fear of making mistakes would overwhelm your ability to function. The modern world has trained you to expect forgiveness for errors, second chances after failures, and support systems that help you recover from setbacks. Medieval scribes had none of these safety nets, and the psychological toll would crush anyone who wasn't already hardened by a lifetime of uncertainty and deprivation. Could you survive the economic uncertainty? You live in a world of employment contracts, labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and social safety nets that provide at least minimal protection against complete destitution. You expect regular paychecks, predictable schedules, and some form of job security. Even in the modern gig economy, which is often compared to medieval working conditions, you have legal protections and social systems that would have been unimaginable to medieval workers. Medieval scribes lived in constant fear of unemployment, with no protection against exploitative patrons, no recourse when clients refused to pay, and no safety net if they became unable to work due to injury or illness. Their income was entirely dependent on their ability to maintain relationships with powerful people who had no legal or moral obligation to treat them fairly. One bad recommendation, one dissatisfied patron, one political change could end their careers permanently. You would be terrified by the complete lack of security, the absence of any protection against exploitation, and the knowledge that your survival depended entirely on the whims of people who viewed you as a useful but replaceable tool. The modern employment system, for all its flaws, provides levels of predictability and protection that you take for granted but couldn't survive without. What about the social isolation? You live in a hyper-connected world where you can communicate instantly with people around the globe, where social media provides constant connection to friends and strangers alike, where entertainment is available on demand 24 hours a day. You probably feel lonely if you go a few hours without checking your phone, or if you spend a weekend without social interaction. Medieval scribes worked in enforced silence for weeks at a time, cut off from normal human conversation, trapped inside their own increasingly unstable minds with nothing but repetitive religious texts for company. They had no entertainment, no distraction, no relief from the grinding monotony of copying the same psalms and prayers over and over until the words became meaningless noise. You would go insane, literally, clinically insane. Your brain, accustomed to constant stimulation and regular social interaction, would begin to malfunction within days of being subjected to medieval working conditions. You would start talking to yourself, hearing voices, developing elaborate fantasy relationships with imaginary people, because your mind would be desperately trying to create the social stimulation it had been denied. The modern world has made you psychologically dependent on external validation, constant entertainment, and regular social feedback. Remove these supports, and you would discover that you lack the internal resources necessary to maintain psychological stability under conditions of extreme isolation and repetitive labor. Could you handle the complete lack of intellectual stimulation? You live in a world of infinite information, where you can satisfy any curiosity instantly, where learning new things is a form of entertainment, where intellectual growth is considered a basic human right. You expect variety in your work, opportunities for creativity, and the ability to pursue your own interests during your free time. Medieval scribes spent their days mechanically reproducing texts they had copied hundreds of times before, forbidden from adding their own thoughts or interpretations, required to suppress their individual creativity in service to absolute accuracy. They had no access to new information, no opportunity for intellectual exploration, no freedom to pursue personal interests or develop individual talents. You would be driven to madness by the intellectual stagnation, the complete absence of novelty, the requirement to suppress your own thoughts and creativity in favor of mindless reproduction. Your modern brain, trained to expect constant mental stimulation and intellectual challenge, would rebel against the deadening repetition that defined scribal work. And what about the spiritual dimension? You live in a largely secular world where religious belief is a personal choice rather than a social requirement, where you can question authority without fear of persecution, where intellectual freedom is taken for granted. Even if you are religious, you probably expect your faith to provide comfort and meaning rather than terror and psychological pressure. Medieval scribes worked under the constant threat of eternal damnation, knowing that their mistakes could corrupt the word of God and endanger not just their own souls, but the souls of everyone who used their manuscripts. They lived in a world where questioning religious authority was heresy, where intellectual independence was spiritual corruption, where every aspect of their work was freighted with supernatural significance. You couldn't handle the psychological weight of believing that your professional performance had eternal consequences not just for yourself, but for countless others. The modern world has trained you to think of work as a secular activity with temporal consequences, not as a spiritual test that could determine the fate of your immortal soul. Let's be honest about your attention span. You live in a world of instant gratification, where you expect immediate results from your efforts, where patience is measured in minutes rather than months. You probably get frustrated when websites take more than a few seconds to load, when projects take longer than expected, when progress isn't immediately visible. Medieval scribes spent months working on single manuscripts, forming individual letters with painstaking precision, creating beauty and meaning one tiny stroke at a time. They had to maintain focus and motivation over extended periods without any immediate reward, any visible progress, any external validation of their efforts. You would quit within days, driven to distraction by the glacial pace of progress, the absence of immediate feedback, the requirement to maintain motivation through sheer willpower rather than external rewards. Your modern brain, conditioned to expect instant results and constant positive reinforcement, simply lacks the capacity for the sustained attention and delayed gratification that medieval manuscript production required. What about your tolerance for discomfort? You live in a world of climate control, ergonomic design, pain management, and abundant medical care. You probably consider minor inconveniences to be significant hardships, and you expect immediate relief from any form of physical or emotional discomfort. Medieval scribes endured chronic pain, eye strain, respiratory problems, and other health issues as routine parts of their profession. They worked through illness, injury, and exhaustion because taking time off meant not eating. They accepted that their work would permanently damage their bodies because the alternative was starvation. You would be completely unable to function under these conditions. Your modern expectations of comfort and medical care would make it impossible for you to continue working through the chronic pain and health problems that medieval scribes accepted as normal parts of their lives. But perhaps most importantly, you lack the psychological resilience that comes from growing up in a world where suffering is normal, where death is commonplace, where security is unknown, and where individual desires are subordinate to survival necessity. Medieval people developed mental toughness through lifelong exposure to hardships that would break modern psyches completely. You've been raised in a world that prioritizes individual happiness, personal fulfillment, and emotional well-being. You expect life to be fair, work to be meaningful, and effort to be rewarded. These expectations would make it impossible for you to adapt to the harsh realities of medieval scribal work, where unfairness was normal, meaning was imposed from outside, and effort was often unrewarded or even punished. The medieval scribe's life was a testament to human endurance under conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. They survived through a combination of necessity, resignation, and psychological adaptations that allowed them to function in an environment designed seemingly to maximize human suffering while demanding perfect performance. You could not do what they did. You could not endure what they endured. You could not sacrifice what they sacrificed. And that's not a moral failing on your part. It's simply recognition that the modern world has shaped you for a different kind of existence, one that would have been unimaginably luxurious to medieval scribes, but has also made you incapable of surviving the brutal realities they face daily. The next time you feel tempted to romanticize the past, to imagine that medieval craftsmen lived more authentic, meaningful lives than modern workers, remember the medieval scribe. Remember the cold stone rooms, the bleeding eyes, the aching backs, the constant fear, the social isolation, the economic uncertainty, and the knowledge that a lifetime of suffering could be rendered meaningless by technological change overnight. Remember that the good old days were only good for the very few who had power, wealth, and options. For everyone else, including the scribes whose work preserved the culture and knowledge that we now admire from our comfortable distance. Life was a grinding struggle against physical hardship, psychological pressure, and social forces designed to extract maximum value from human labor while providing minimum reward. The medieval scribe story is not a tale of noble suffering in service to higher ideals. It's a cautionary reminder that most of human history has been characterized by conditions that would be considered intolerable by modern standards, endured by people who had no choice but to endure them, in service to systems that valued their output far more than their humanity. So the next time you're tempted to complain about your modern working conditions, your contemporary stresses, your current challenges, take a moment to appreciate the vast improvements in human welfare that separate your life from that of a medieval scribe. And perhaps spare a thought for those forgotten craftsmen who spent their lives hunched over manuscripts in freezing scriptoriums, slowly destroying their bodies and minds in service to preserving the knowledge that forms the foundation of our modern world. They deserve to be remembered not as romantic figures from a mythical golden age, but as real people who endured real suffering to create real beauty in a world that offered them precious little beauty in return. Their sacrifice was not noble because it was chosen, but because it was necessary, and because, through some miracle of human resilience, they managed to create lasting works of art and scholarship despite conditions that should have made such creation impossible. The medieval scribes' legacy is not just the manuscripts they produced, but the testament they left to human endurance, creativity, and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We honor them best not by romanticizing their suffering, but by recognizing it honestly and ensuring that the modern world they helped create offers better opportunities for human flourishing than the brutal conditions they were forced to endure. In the end, that may be the most important lesson the medieval scribe can teach us, that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievement even under extraordinary hardship, but that such hardship should be eliminated whenever possible rather than celebrated as character building or spiritually meaningful. The goal of civilization should be to create conditions where human creativity can flourish without requiring human sacrifice, where knowledge can be preserved without destroying the people who preserve it, and where the pursuit of beauty and truth doesn't demand the brutal subjugation of those who make such pursuit possible. The age of the medieval scribe is over, ended by technological progress that made their suffering unnecessary and their skills obsolete. We should be grateful for their sacrifice while working to ensure that future generations never again face the choice between knowledge and humanity, between cultural preservation and personal well-being, between serving civilization and surviving as human beings. That perhaps is the true measure of progress, not just the advancement of technology or the accumulation of knowledge, but the creation of conditions where human beings can contribute to the preservation and advancement of culture without sacrificing their health, their sanity, or their humanity in the process. The medieval scribes paid that price so that we wouldn't have to. The least we can do is remember them accurately, honor their sacrifice genuinely, and build a world where such sacrifice is no longer necessary. begins to fracture under.